Even in right-wing governments, in governments that are deeply right-wing, we see that it's hard for us to ultimately break free from our own guiding perceptions. Of course, every decision made here by the government is subject to a very large public, a lot of criticism, a lot of noise, and so on. But I think that at the end of the day, the state of Israel ultimately, in the long run, cannot afford to have such neighbors on the other side of the fence. Neighbors who, in the end, wake up in the morning and ask themselves, that is, what can they do for jihad?
Hello everyone, you're with us here on Tov channel. We all long for the moment when Hamas will break, will be destroyed. In the meantime, Hamas is showing resilience. Despite all the tremendous blows that the IDF has dealt it, our soldiers, our fighters, may God protect them all, Hamas is still showing resilience. We want to take a deeper look at this story with Elad ben Achdut.
Hello.
An expert on the Middle East. Give us your insight. Israeli citizens are watching and saying, no matter how hard you hit them, they still show resilience. What's the story?
In my humble opinion, what lies at the root of Hamas's resilience is, first of all, the fact that we're dealing with a religious organization. A religious organization with very, very messianic worldviews, whose ideological and theological goal is, in fact, the destruction of Israel. This is a goal they see as long-term, if you will. Their raison d'être, their reason for existence, nothing less than that. And the second thing that sustains its resilience under extremely aggressive conditions of a war that has been going on for a year and 7 months is the fact that it holds hostages in its hands. By the very fact that it is holding a significant number of hostages, both living and dead, as far as we know, this is a card that allows it to continue waging a tough campaign against Israel and not raise the white flag. That is to say, it's important to understand, when it comes to jihadist organizations in general, whatever they may be, whether they are Sunni jihadist organizations or Shia jihadist organizations, in this constellation of political Islam, as long as they have cards in their hands, they will not raise a white flag. Therefore, I always argue from this point that the two sacred war objectives we set for ourselves after the October bloodbath cannot both be achieved simultaneously. It's hard for many in the Israeli public and also for the right-wing public to accept this, but de facto, we will have difficulty continuing. We will have difficulty defeating Hamas on its own home turf, which is the Gaza Strip, if you will. The Gaza Strip is the historical center of gravity for the Hamas movement. We will have difficulty, so to speak, subduing Hamas while they are still holding hostages in their hands. Therefore, in my view, the need for a deal to release the hostages is an absolute necessity.
It's a necessity.
An urgent necessity, so that afterwards we can pursue the next goal, which is to defeat and destroy Hamas. If we want to wage a total war against Hamas, we must actually make the territory of the Gaza Strip completely sterile, without hostages.
You know, Hamas isn't naive. If they tell you, listen, you want all the hostages back home, that's only if you give us an absolute commitment with international guarantees that you won't come back here. What you're suggesting is, let's first bring the hostages back, and then we'll wage the ultimate war against them for total destruction, which is basically what happened in Lebanon and Syria, so everything was much simpler there. The argument sounds reasonable, but again, it's impossible, because Hamas won't give you the hostages back unless they get another bargaining chip of equal value that protects them from destruction. Look, my argument here comes from a perspective that isn't Western, but rather it is specifically a Middle Eastern perspective. Agreements, whatever they may be, okay, are generally considered worthless in the Middle East, no less than that, and that's important to understand. Now, if we look at this historically as well, and to make a distinction, when we signed the peace agreement, the historic one with Egypt in the spring of 1979, between Menachem Begin, of blessed memory, and President Muhammad Anwar Sadat, this agreement was actually based on a religious ruling, a fatwa, which itself relied on the concept of the parable, the historical story of Muhammad and the tribes in Mecca, the Treaty of Hudaybiyah. That is to say, from the Muslim perspective, from the Arab perspective, this agreement is seen as a temporary provisional agreement, something akin to a ceasefire agreement. We regard it through Arab eyes as a peace agreement. Okay, and it still stands the test of reality in the Middle East. There is no real agreement with Israel. It's all just a step on the way to destruction. I argue that in the end, especially after the terrible bloodshed we experienced here in October, we must change our mindset. Okay, we sign agreements, we go for international guarantees, we seemingly give them what they want, but it's all just an illusion.
As long as we continue heading toward a state of war, in my opinion, a total war, while, so to speak, within the confines of underground Gaza, we still have hostages, I think that with such a move, regretfully, I say this, but again, it's my opinion, we might also lose the hostages, because if Hamas feels it is being pushed too far against the wall, then it will have no moral or ethical qualms, and we know who we're dealing with, about murdering the hostages while they're still alive.
So basically, what you're suggesting to the state of Israel is this. You're saying, make a ceasefire agreement, essentially end the war, get all the hostages back, and then the day after you get everyone back, start the war again and break the agreement you signed.
The scenario, I know that to many people it seems imaginary.
No, it's imaginary because of Israeli culture. The state of Israel would never do such a thing, and America wouldn't let it do such a thing either.
It's true that in the end, what actually puts a stumbling block here, or as some might say, a stick in the wheels, is really due to our own inherent limitations and also our particular perspective on how exactly we should conduct wars in the region. In my view, it's not at all strange, especially in light of what we experienced here on October 7th, to conduct some sort of political process with Hamas. Now, I know that for many people, or for some people, this sounds like a somewhat strange idea, something out of the box, but I think that in the end, if today we start from a moral and ethical standpoint, that Hamas as a movement, as well as Islamic Jihad, can no longer remain our neighbors on the other side of the fence. And on the other hand, the way to eliminate these murderous organizations must go through the return of the hostages. First of all, I say, let's separate the issue of the hostages, because in my eyes, there is no greater Jewish act than redeeming captives, which is something we are commanded to do in Jewish sources. And the moment the hostages return to the embrace of the homeland and their families, we will first of all need to enter some kind of process of reorganization, at least within the ranks of the army and also within the ranks of the General Security Service, which are the two bodies responsible for the war inside the land and the Gaza Strip. And after a period in which we reorganize ourselves and give our good and valiant fighters a bit of a breather, we will be able to go out to war again. I'll tell you why I say this, because in the end, whether we want to or not, Hamas, that is, if he receives all the international guarantees, what will he do the next day? He will start rebuilding his power structure from scratch. He'll begin recruiting into the ranks of the Izz ad-Din al-Qassam brigades, again, more fighters. He'll start, as they say, receiving funds from all sorts of hostile regional actors. Turkey, if you will, the most Muslim country, Qatar, Iran, all of them will funnel money there and send weapons there while we are not present in the area. Hamas will see these agreements as a hudna. What is the meaning of a hudna? What does Odana mean to him? Which essentially means it's a timeout that he takes in order to strengthen his ranks to reinforce the Muslim fighter, okay? So that, once again, he can launch a renewed campaign against the Jewish state, the state of the settlers, the state of the infidels, let's call it as they do. I'm using their terminology here. Now, so I'm saying, in the end, Hamas itself gave us the justification for war, because ultimately, I'm saying its raison d'etre, its very concept of existence, is the destruction of Israel. That is its recognition of you. It is its recognition of us.
So basically, you're telling us, friends, there are three options here, and the best option, according to you, is the one you're proposing. One option is to go all the way with the war, but then you're actually endangering the lives of the hostages. The second option is to release the hostages, but in effect, surrender to Hamas. And so you're saying, friends, if we value life, we're left with only one option: to deceive Hamas. That is to make a deal with them, get the hostages out, and immediately afterwards go to war, which in my opinion, the main problem here is the Israeli cultural issue, which probably won't be able to handle this. You notice that I'm being careful all the time because the questions here are very heavy. At some point, someone will come and say, you're protecting the lives of 24 hostages. May God watch over them. We truly pray that we will merit to see them here alive and healthy. And when you come to protect the lives of 24 hostages, in the meantime, you may not notice, but the price you pay in soldiers' lives, starts to rise and soar and far surpass that number. Meaning, if a robot came along devoid of emotions, looking at things purely with intellectual intelligence, it might tell you, listen, in this situation, according to the most terrible game theory scenarios we could imagine, a dreadful game of logic, you have no choice. You're actually endangering far more than 24 people by trying to save those 24 hostages. What do you say to that?
First of all, that's true. I'm saying factually, if we examine this in a rational and cold manner, the moment you send in forces, infantry, underground units, reservists, and armored corps into the area, okay, into territory that to a large extent still has organized cells present. I just want, to give the public watching this channel some perspective. Look, for a year and 7 months, we've been operating in the Gaza Strip. And in 30% of the territory we haven't touched. We haven't dealt with the entire area of the central camps. That is Nusayrat, Al-Buraish, Deir al-Bala, and Al-Maghazi. These are places where we've only operated in small parts of them, meaning when we enter deep into these places, we will encounter the same traps we saw in Jabalia, that we saw in Beit Hanun, that we saw in the neighborhoods of the Rafah camp, and so on, in Shabora, in Yabna. And so I'm saying, in the end, it's clear that even if we go after today, after a year and 7 months, for a so-called total war, for the occupation of the Gaza Strip, for taking territory from Hamas and Islamic Jihad in their stronghold areas, we need to understand meaning as a consideration, which is a very, very difficult one emotionally, but on a rational level, to understand that it could cost us lives in soldiers who will be killed while it has been cleared for publication.
And therefore, perhaps an operation that would be a total operation, merciless in quotes, would still adhere to international law, but exactly to international law. It could be that this is what's necessary, and I'll leave that open. You've presented your approach, I'll leave it open. By the way, when you mentioned Deir al-Bala, I get this pang in my heart because I served there for about 7 years before the Oslo Accords, and we used to walk around there like we owned the place. There was no threat, nothing, and I even spent a week sitting on the beach in Azar, just guarding the sea. It was like sitting on the beach in Tel Aviv, more or less. And honestly, what the Oslo Accords did to us was simply unimaginable damage. Back then, things looked completely different. The Oslo Accords destroyed it.
In the 1980s, I'm talking about the era before the outbreak of the first Intifada in December 1987. In fact, the Hamas movement, which was established in the early days of the Intifada, built its mechanisms then. In fact, the organization that preceded Hamas, or rather the foundation from which the Hamas movement emerged, was the organization called Al-Mujamma al-Islami, which was also led by Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, who was assassinated in 2004 near his home in the Sabra neighborhood, and from which, in delegations. What happens in the 1980s is that the mechanisms of Hamas are being established within the Gaza Strip in various areas. At that time, we made a choice that, in my view, was very flawed from a moral standpoint. That is to say, the military administration that was in the Gaza Strip saw the people of Hamas and the people of the Mujamma, the Muslim Brotherhood, as interlocutors in order to create, at the time, a counterweight against the PLO movement, Yasser Arafat's Fatah, which at the time was considered our main enemy within Palestinian society, partly because their leadership was in exile abroad, in Lebanon, Tunisia, and so on. What ended up happening? Egyptian diplomats, who were dealing with Israeli officials in the foreign ministry, said to them, "What are you doing? Have you lost your minds? Do you put your father? Are you relying on the Islamists?" That is in these very words, because they knew the DNA of these people from Egypt as a very, very subversive opposition movement against the regime in Egypt. So that's one point. The 1980s were very, very turbulent, extremely turbulent. Hamas was in the process of organizing. It was also very active internally, trying to purify local society from what it saw as various immoral blights. So it established there the internal security apparatuses, the Majd apparatus. In its southern sector, the person in charge was Yahya Sinwar, and in the northern area, the one responsible was Rawhi Mushtaha. So they supposedly pursued their own brothers, people accused of selling alcohol, God forbid, distributing pornography, and similar things, all considered impure in Islam. As a result, people there were persecuted for these reasons and even murdered, and some were falsely accused, supposedly, of espionage or collaboration with the Israeli security services, with the Shin Bet. I mean, I'm saying that same Hamas that we, so to speak, in our foolishness at the time, nurtured, in other words, because Sheikh Yassin told the military administration, you want the area to be calm here. You don't want kids throwing stones. You don't want kids playing with shrapnel grenades and the like. So let me set up sports clubs here. Let me build basketball courts. Let me build more mosques. And in fact, the military administration provided all the economic framework and even the infrastructure as someone who was in charge of the area, as someone who was responsible for the area. And it's simply something Ahmed Yassin, really, I say from a historical perspective, the man was a genius. He masterfully prepared, in fact, the hearts of many within the Gaza Strip, especially the younger generation who matured and reached the first intifada. They became the stone throwers. And when the second intifada began already in the early 1990s, they became the first armed members of Izz ad-Din al-Qassam, those same little children he had nurtured since the 1980s.
It hurts. It breaks your heart. I remember they told us one night we were going into Idna. Why? There was someone there they thought might have a pistol. Just try to understand what things used to be like here. People today don't know the reality that once was. They thought there was a house, there's a pistol in Idna, so we did a night raid just to get to a house that maybe had a pistol. Just think about where we are today and what things were like back then. In our foolishness, we built this whole monster. It's just terrible.
By the way, the last reserve duty I did in the area of South Hebron, you really have to be in the villages of West Hebron, in Idna, in Beit Awa, and in Deir Samet. Listen, all of them are Hamas strongholds. Now look, these places became Hamas strongholds already during the second Intifada. There were armed cells of Izz ad-Din al-Qassam there, a lot of weapons inside the villages, and many ideologues of the movement. I'll never forget that during the last operations, as an Arabic speaker, I entered one of the houses, a doctor who was a lecturer at the Islamic University in Hebron. Now look, he's not a classic Islamic ideologue, someone who could, so to speak, engage in some kind of civilized theological dialogue with Judaism, okay? Instead, you see a person whose mind is deeply immersed in the most radical concepts of political Islam. And I entered the house and what I saw before my eyes were two pictures. One of Abdel al-Barouti, the engineer behind the attacks during the second Intifada, who was sentenced to 66 life terms in Israeli prison. And the other picture is of the martyr Yahya Ayyash, that same Yahya Ayyash who was assassinated in Beit Lahia in 96, the engineer, right? Elad bin Achdut Mizrahan, Arab Affairs commentator. It was very, very interesting. Thank you very much.